Karen had been a thorn in my side since the day I moved into my lakeside cabin. The cabin wasn't just a house to me. It was my sanctuary, the one place I could truly enjoy my retirement in peace. The smell of pine trees, the gentle waves lapping against the shore, the fresh morning air, all of it made me feel alive again. But Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the nearby HOA, had decided that my property was somehow under her jurisdiction. Never mind that my land wasn't part of the HOA. Never mind that I had zero interest in their ridiculous rules about mailbox colors and acceptable lawn gnome placements. To Karen, rules were merely tools to control others, and she had set her sights on me. It started small. I'd wake up to find my private dock being used by her guests as if it were a public marina. Lawn chairs would mysteriously appear, along with beer bottles and snack wrappers. I politely confronted her the first time, thinking maybe it was just a misunderstanding. "Oh, don't be so selfish," she had said with that fake smile, waving a dismissive hand. "The community loves this spot. It's practically a shared space." That was the first red flag. I corrected her, told her in no uncertain terms that this land was mine and that I wouldn't tolerate trespassers. She simply smirked, as if she hadn't heard a word I said. Then, things escalated. One morning, I found a group of teenagers having a bonfire right in my backyard, feet away from my wooden deck. When I told them to leave, they shrugged and said, "Karen said we could use it." That was when I realized she wasn't just ignoring me. She was actively encouraging people to trespass. I confronted her again, and this time she laughed in my face. "Don't be such a grump," she said. "You're retired, aren't you? What else do you have to do but share?" That was the moment I knew this wasn't going to stop. Karen wasn't just inconsiderate. She was entitled, and she believed that if she said something enough times, it became true. I called the sheriff's office, but they were useless. "Technically, she's not the one trespassing," the deputy told me. "If you catch people on your property, you can ask them to leave, and if they refuse, we can remove them. But unless you have no trespassing signs and some kind of deterrent, people will just keep coming." Deterrent. Now, that was an idea. That very evening, I walked the perimeter of my property and started planning. If Karen wanted to play games, I'd play too, but by my rules. First, I installed cameras. Not those tiny ones you barely notice, but big, obvious ones with blinking red lights. The kind that made people second-guess their actions. Then, I put up metal fencing along the most frequently used paths. But the real masterpiece? An electric fence. Not lethal, of course, just a little zap. Enough to make someone think twice before barging onto my land. I gave a few days before the first incident. I was sipping my morning coffee on my porch when I heard a loud yelp. Peeking through my binoculars, I saw the unmistakable shape of Karen clutching her hand, staring in disbelief at the fence. She had obviously tried to unlatch it and got a shocking surprise instead. She stomped back toward the HOA neighborhood, her face red with anger. I smiled to myself. That should have been the end of it. But of course, Karen didn't know how to take a hint. The next day, I found a group of HOA members gathered at my fence, led by Karen. They were pointing, whispering, shaking their heads in disgust. I walked over, casually holding my coffee. "Something wrong?" I asked, keeping my voice as friendly as possible. Karen spun around, her expression a mixture of outrage and determination. "This," she hissed, waving at the fence, "is unacceptable." I took a sip of my coffee. "Is that so?" "This," she continued, her voice rising, "is an aggressive obstruction. It makes the community look hostile. People feel unwelcome." I raised an eyebrow. "Good. That was the point." She gasped as if I had just insulted her personally. "You can't do this," she said. "You don't have the authority to put up a fence like this." I chuckled. "Karen, this is private property. I have every right to put up whatever fence I want. And considering how many of your little guests have been trespassing, I'd say this is overdue." Her lips thinned. "I'm going to the city board about this," she snapped. "This fence is a safety hazard." I shrugged. "Go ahead." She stared at me, expecting me to back down. But I didn't. Because unlike her, I knew the law. I had already checked with the county. The fence was completely legal. Karen stormed off, and I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd finally gotten the message. But the real fight was just beginning. That night, I was woken up by the sound of someone cutting through my fence. I grabbed my flashlight and slipped outside, moving silently toward the sound. As I got closer, I saw the unmistakable figure of Karen and two other HOA board members with bolt cutters. I watched, stunned, as they snipped a section of the fence and pushed it open. They actually thought they could get away with this. Smirking, I reached for my phone. I had been waiting for this moment. The sheriff was going to love this. Karen and her little band of HOA warriors had no idea that my cameras were already recording their every move. As I crouched behind the tree line, my phone in hand, I watched them work like criminals in the night, their whispers carried by the cool lake breeze. Karen, ever the ringleader, stood with her hands on her hips, instructing the two men who struggled with the bolt cutters against the thick metal of my fence. Sparks flew as they forced the blades against the wire, determined to undo what I had built. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I simply let the footage roll, waiting for the perfect moment. Finally, with one final snap, the section of fencing gave way, and they pushed it open like conquering heroes. Karen stepped forward, testing the ground beyond, as if she had just reclaimed stolen territory. She smirked, hands on her hips, basking in her imaginary victory. That was when I turned on my flashlight, aiming the beam directly at them like a spotlight, catching burglars in the act. Karen shrieked, shielding her eyes, while the two men jumped back, one of them nearly falling over his own feet. I let the silence stretch between us, the tension thick, their guilt obvious. Karen was the first to recover, straightening up and try to regain control of the situation, but it was too late for that. I stepped forward, phone raised, making sure they saw the screen, where their crime was playing back in real time. The realization dawned on her face slowly, her smirk faltering, replaced by something that looked an awful lot like fear. I told her, in no uncertain terms, that this was destruction of private property, trespassing, and possibly even conspiracy. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again as if searching for some legal loophole that would make this all okay. But there was none. The two men with her shifted uncomfortably, now very aware of just how bad this looked. One of them turned on his heel, and Power walked away without a word. The other mumbled something about not wanting to be involved before jogging after his friend, leaving Karen standing there alone in the beam of my flashlight. She tried to bluster her way through, saying that the fence was an eyesore, that it violated community standards, that she had every right to make adjustments for the good of the neighborhood. But I just laughed because I knew, and she knew, that none of those words mattered. The law was not on her side, and this time, she was caught red-handed. I gave her one final warning, telling her to get off my land before I called the sheriff. She hesitated, fuming, before finally stomping away, her expensive heels crunching against the gravel path as she disappeared into the darkness. I waited until she was out of sight before taking one last slow look at the damage. The fence was cut, but it was fixable. Karen, however, had just made a mistake she wouldn't be able to repair. The next morning, I drove straight to the sheriff's office with my footage. The deputy watched it twice, shaking his head before whistling low under his breath. He didn't even hesitate before filing the report. Trespassing was one thing, but cutting a secured fence? That was considered destruction of property, and now Karen had a case against her. I knew the moment she received the call because my phone started blowing up with unknown numbers. I ignored them all, letting her squirm. I spent the afternoon repairing my fence, replacing the section she had damaged with a new, stronger piece. And this time, I upgraded the voltage. It wasn't enough to hurt anyone, just enough to make sure no one would be trying to cut through again anytime soon. It wasn't long before the HOA started retaliating. The passive-aggressive letters began arriving in my mailbox. Notices about imaginary infractions, vague threats about consequences if I didn't comply with HOA standards, warnings about neighborly conduct. I didn't even bother opening most of them. Instead, I collected them in a neat little folder just in case I needed more evidence later. Karen wasn't giving up easily, but neither was I. The real battle was just getting started. The day the HOA held their emergency meeting about my unacceptable behavior, I decided to attend, not because I cared about their opinions, but because I wanted to watch Karen try to explain herself. I walked into the community center and immediately felt the tension in the air. People whispered as I passed, some looking guilty, others curious. Karen sat at the front, her usual smugness replaced by something a little more desperate. The moment the meeting started, she launched into a dramatic speech about protecting the integrity of the neighborhood and how certain individuals were acting in ways that disrupted the community. She didn't say my name, but we all knew who she meant. Then, she made a fatal mistake. She called for a vote to have me fined for my fence and aggressive behavior. But before anyone could raise a hand, I stood up, pulled out my phone, and played the video for the entire room. The silence that followed was beautiful. Every single person watched Karen get caught in the act. Her excuses, her lies, her destruction of property, all of it playing out on the projector screen. The gasps, the side eyes, the people whispering to each other. Karen's perfect little world was crumbling right in front of her. Someone in the back muttered, "She really cut his fence?" And that was all it took. The tide turned instantly. The vice president of the HOA, a woman named Linda, stood up and cleared her throat awkwardly before suggesting that perhaps this wasn't something the HOA should be involved in. Another member asked Karen point-blank why she was on my property at night. Her face turned red, but she didn't have an answer. When I pointed out that I had already filed a report with the sheriff, the meeting was effectively over. The HOA didn't want anything to do with this mess. One by one, people turned against Karen. The whispers grew louder, the judgment heavier, until she finally grabbed her things and stormed out, leaving behind the HOA she had once ruled like a queen. As I walked back to my truck, I knew that this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to go down without a fight, but she had underestimated me, and now she was the one on the defensive. I wasn't just going to sit back and wait for her next move. I was going to end this once and for all. Karen's downfall at the HOA meeting should have been the final nail in the coffin, but I knew she wouldn't go down without dragging everyone else into the dirt with her. Sure enough, the very next morning, I woke up to find a new letter in my mailbox, one that wasn't like the previous passive-aggressive notices she had been sending. This one was official. A formal complaint had been filed against me with the city council, stating that my electric fence was a public safety hazard and a violation of neighborhood aesthetics. That last part made me laugh out loud. Aesthetics? This was a lakeside property, not some fancy golf course community. The only thing my fence was ruining was Karen's ability to trespass whenever she wanted. But this wasn't just another empty threat. Karen had called in some favors, and the city had scheduled a hearing to discuss whether my fence would need to be removed. She wasn't just playing HOA games anymore. She was trying to use the law against me. I wasn't about to take this lying down. I spent the next few days preparing. I gathered all my property records, the permits proving my fence was legal, and, most importantly, the footage of Karen trespassing and destroying my property. The day of the hearing arrived, and I walked into the city council building with confidence. Karen, on the other hand, looked a little less composed. She had expected me to roll over, to panic, to show up unprepared and beg for permission to key my fence. Instead, I sat calmly as the committee read the complaint, waiting for my turn to speak. When it came, I didn't just defend my fence, I went on the attack. I played the video footage once again, showing Karen and her goons cutting through my property. I presented the sheriff's report. I even submitted the folder of HOA harassment letters as evidence that this wasn't about safety or aesthetics. This was about Karen's personal vendetta. The room was silent by the time I finished. One of the city officials cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. He glanced at Karen, then back at me. "Mr. Dawson, your fence does not appear to violate any zoning laws. There is no precedent for forcing you to remove it. As long as it remains within your property boundaries, it is well within your rights." Karen's mouth fell open. Her face turned bright red, and she shot up from her seat, spluttering about how this was unfair, how I was being aggressive, how I was ruining the neighborhood. But the officials weren't interested in her theatrics. They dismissed the complaint entirely. Karen had lost again. She stormed out before the hearing was even over, shoving past reporters who had shown up after hearing about the HOA scandal. That was when I realized just how big this had gotten. People were talking. The entire town was interested in what was happening between me and Karen. And suddenly, she wasn't just an annoying neighbor. She was a public embarrassment. That evening, I sat on my porch with a fresh cup of coffee, watching the sun dip behind the trees, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in weeks. Karen had tried everything: intimidation, legal threats, even public humiliation, but nothing had worked. I thought maybe, just maybe, she had finally learned her lesson, but I underestimated just how desperate she was. Around midnight, I was woken up by the sound of a loud engine rumbling outside. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the window. A large black SUV was parked at the edge of my property, its headlights off, engine idling. My heart started pounding. This wasn't some HOA stunt. This felt different. I grabbed my phone, hit record, and quietly stepped outside. As I approached, the SUV suddenly reversed, kicking up gravel as it sped away. I barely caught a glimpse of the driver, but something in my gut told me I already knew who it was. The next morning, I found deep tire tracks in my yard, leading dangerously close to my fence. Someone had been testing it, checking for weak spots. I wasn't just dealing with petty HOA politics anymore. Karen had crossed into something worse. She was getting desperate, and desperate people made mistakes. I went straight to the sheriff's office again, this time with my new footage. They agreed to send more patrols through the area, but I knew that wouldn't stop Karen. She wasn't going to quit until she had either forced me out or gotten herself into real trouble. I decided it was time to take things up a notch. If she wanted to escalate, I would too. First, I reinforced my fence with thicker wiring and an extra layer of security cameras. Then, I installed motion-activated floodlights, big, blinding ones that would turn my property into daylight the moment someone set foot where they shouldn't. Finally, I added a little surprise near the back entrance where Karen had been sneaking in before. A harmless but extremely unpleasant deterrent: skunk spray. A few well-placed canisters rigged to go off if someone disturbed them. If Karen or anyone else tried to trespass again, they wouldn't just be caught on camera. They'd be running home smelling like a walking disaster. It only took 2 nights before my plan worked. Just after midnight, my phone buzzed with an alert from the security cameras. I opened the live feed, and sure enough, there she was, Karen, creeping toward the back of my property, bolt cutters in hand. I almost laughed at the sheer audacity of it. As soon as she stepped into the designated area, the floodlights snapped on. She froze like a deer in headlights. Then, a split second later, the skunk deterrent triggered. A fine mist sprayed right into her face, and the reaction was instant. She screamed, a loud, piercing, horrified scream, and staggered backward, hands flailing. She tripped over her own feet, went sprawling into the dirt, and lay there for a few seconds, stunned. I watched, completely entertained, as she scrambled up, gagging, and bolted toward her car, leaving the bolt cutters behind. The cameras caught everything. The moment she sped off, I sent the footage straight to the sheriff's office. The next morning, I got a call from a very tired-sounding deputy. "Mr. Dawson," he sighed, "we got your video. Karen has officially been charged with trespassing, vandalism, and attempted property damage. She'll have to appear in court." That was the moment I knew I had won. Karen had finally pushed too far, and this time there was no escape. The HOA couldn't protect her. The city council wouldn't back her. She was on her own. And the best part? She had done it to herself. The fallout was immediate. News spread fast, and soon, even the most loyal HOA members were distancing themselves from her. Nobody wanted to be associated with the woman who got arrested for sneaking onto private property and getting sprayed like a common pest. She disappeared from public view, stopped showing up to HOA meetings, and within a week, her house had a for sale sign in front of it. Karen was leaving. For good. I didn't see her on the day she packed up and drove away, but I knew that somewhere she was fuming, defeated, humiliated beyond repair. As I stood on my porch, looking out over my peaceful, now Karen-free property, I raised my coffee mug in silent victory. The war was over. My land was mine again, and for the first time in a long time, I could finally enjoy the quiet. Karen had thought she could control everything, but in the end, All she had controlled was her own downfall. Karen's departure should have been the end of it, but the echoes of her reign over the HOA still lingered like a bad smell. Even though she was gone, her influence had left behind a group of loyal followers who weren't quite ready to give up their self-proclaimed authority over the neighborhood. The HOA had lost its queen, but the remaining board members were scrambling to maintain control, trying to regain the power that Karen had so recklessly burned to the ground. It started with little things. Random visits from so-called compliance officers, who were nothing more than nosy neighbors with clipboards, peering over my fence, taking notes, and whispering among themselves. They didn't have Karen's aggressive confidence, but they still clung to the fantasy that they could dictate what happened on my land. I ignored them at first, letting them waste their time, but then the notices started arriving again. They were the same kind of empty threats that Karen used to send, claims that my fence was still a violation, that my security lights were excessive, that my property was an eyesore to the community. I knew these letters held no legal weight, but that didn't mean they weren't annoying. It was clear they were trying to wear me down, hoping I'd eventually give up and comply with their nonsense just to make them go away. What they didn't understand was that I had already gone through the worst of it with Karen, and their pathetic attempts didn't even come close to shaking me. Instead of reacting, I documented everything. Every letter, every unwanted visit, every time I caught them snooping around my fence with their little clipboards. I wasn't just going to wait for them to cross the line. I was going to make sure that when they did, I'd be ready. It didn't take long for them to slip up. One afternoon, I was out by the lake, enjoying the peace and quiet, when I noticed movement near my fence line. 2 HOA members, an older couple I recognized from previous meetings, were standing at the edge of my property, having what they probably thought was a private conversation. I turned on a microphone on my security system and listened. They were discussing fixing the problem Karen had left behind, talking about ways to convince me to take down the fence and make my land more accessible for community use. That was enough for me. I walked toward them, making sure they saw me before they had the chance to slip away. They stammered something about checking property lines, but I cut them off before they could finish. I let them know, in no uncertain terms, that I had recorded every word they just said, and that if I caught them trespassing, harassing me, or attempting to tamper with my property, I would press charges. The color drained from their faces as they realized they had been caught. They mumbled excuses and hurried away, but I knew this wasn't over. That night, I reviewed my recordings, putting together a case just in case I needed it. But as I prepared for yet another round of battle, something unexpected happened. The neighborhood itself started turning against the HOA. The residents had seen what happened with Karen. They had watched her downfall, and now, many of them were realizing just how much of a stranglehold the HOA had placed on them over the years. People started questioning the rules. Homeowners who had been too scared to speak up before were now openly complaining about unfair fines, ridiculous restrictions, and the way the board members had been abusing their power. Meetings that were once filled with unquestioning compliance turned into debates, with more and more people standing up and demanding changes. The board was losing control, and they knew it. The final blow came when one of the longtime residents, an elderly man named Frank, decided he had had enough. Frank had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years, long before the HOA was even formed. He was well respected, and when he spoke, people listened. At the next meeting, he stood up and delivered a speech that left the entire room silent. He talked about how the HOA had started as a way to keep the neighborhood organized, but had turned into something toxic, something that wasn't about helping homeowners, but controlling them. He pointed out how Karen's obsession with power had destroyed her, and how the board was now trying to continue that same legacy, even after she was gone. Then, he made a motion to hold a vote, to decide whether the HOA should be completely dissolved. The reaction was immediate. The board members panicked, trying to shut down the discussion, claiming it was against the bylaws to hold such a vote. But Frank had come prepared. He had spoken to a lawyer, gathered support from dozens of homeowners, and had the necessary paperwork to prove that a vote to dissolve the HOA was legal. People started cheering, nodding, agreeing with him. The board members looked like cornered rats, scrambling for any excuse to shut it down, but it was too late. The vote was happening, and they were powerless to stop it. On the day of the vote, the entire neighborhood showed up. People who had never attended a meeting before were there, eager to finally have a say in how their community was run. When the results were counted, it wasn't even close. Over 80% of homeowners voted in favor of dissolving the HOA. Just like that, it was over. Decades of control, of pointless rules and power-hungry leaders, erased in a single night. The board members had no choice but to step down, their authority stripped away. As I stood at the back of the room, watching it all unfold, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This had started as a personal battle, but it had turned into something bigger. Karen had tried to control my land, to force me into submission, but in the end, she had only sealed her own fate. And now, because of her, the HOA no longer existed. A few weeks later, the neighborhood felt different, lighter. People were friendlier, less tense. The constant fear of being fined for ridiculous reasons was gone. Homeowners started painting their houses whatever colors they wanted. Garden gnomes appeared in front yards. Porch swings were hung without permits, and kids finally had lemonade stands without getting shut down. The neighborhood had changed, and it was better for it. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the lake, Frank stopped by. He handed me a cold beer and sat down beside me, looking out at the water. He didn't say much, just nodded in approval of my fence and my land, at the peace we had all fought for. "You did good," he finally said, raising his drink in a silent toast. I clinked my bottle against his and smiled. We all did. The battle was over. The HOA was gone. And for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood truly belonged to the people who lived in it. No more Karen. No more ridiculous rules. Just freedom. And as the sun set over the lake, I knew that peace had finally, truly, returned. The weeks that followed the HOA's collapse were some of the most peaceful I had experienced since moving into my lakeside cabin. For the first time, there were no more threatening letters, no more nosy neighbors sneaking around with clipboards, and most importantly, no more Karen. Her house had sold faster than I expected, probably because she was desperate to get out of town after her embarrassing downfall. Whoever bought, it was a quiet couple who kept to themselves, and that suited me just fine. The best part? The neighborhood felt alive again. People had been living under HOA control for so long that they had forgotten what it meant to actually enjoy their own homes. Now, with no ridiculous fines hanging over their heads, folks started making changes. Yards were no longer forced to look like cookie-cutter displays. People put up fences, added garden decorations, even built small sheds and patios that the old board would have never allowed. It was like watching a place come back to life after years of being suffocated by rules. I noticed the difference immediately. Where before there had always been a sense of tension, now there was laughter. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other were now having backyard barbecues together. Kids played in the streets without fear of being scolded for disrupting the neighborhood's atmosphere. Dogs ran freely in yards that used to be tightly controlled by leash laws Karen had once insisted on enforcing. Even the lake, which Karen had tried to claim as an extension of the HOA's territory, became a place where people gathered freely, launching kayaks, fishing, and enjoying what should have always been a shared natural treasure. It was a victory, not just for me, but for everyone who had suffered under the HOA's ridiculous reign. One afternoon, as I was working on reinforcing the dock behind my cabin, Frank stopped by again. He had become something of a friend in all of this, and I respected him. He had been one of the few in the neighborhood with the courage to stand up against Karen even before she had set her sights on me. We sat by the water, drinking cold beer and talking about how things had changed. He told me about an old couple down the street who had finally been able to repaint their house the bright blue color they had always wanted. Another neighbor had put up a massive tree house for his grandkids, something that would have never been approved before. It was good to hear, good to know that people were reclaiming their homes, their land, their right to live how they wanted. As the sun set, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, true contentment. I had fought, I had won, and now I could finally enjoy the peace and quiet I had wanted when I moved here. But just when I thought the drama was over, a new problem began to creep in, one that no one had expected. Without the HOA, some parts of the neighborhood began to struggle with basic upkeep. The roads, once maintained through HOA fees, started developing cracks and potholes. Streetlights went out and weren't replaced as quickly. Some of the communal areas, like the park near the lake, became a little less tidy without the enforced rules. It wasn't anything major, but people started noticing, and soon, small complaints began bubbling up in conversations. At first, it was nothing serious, just mild grumbling from homeowners who had gotten used to the structured way things had been before. But then, a few of the former HOA loyalists started whispering about bringing it back. Not the way Karen had run it, of course, they insisted, but a fair version, one that wouldn't be as strict but would still provide needed structure. The idea made my stomach turn. I had fought too hard to see that nightmare return. I knew that once you gave people a little power, it was only a matter of time before they started abusing it again. It was in their nature. Frank and I, along with a few others, decided we weren't going to let that happen. Instead of allowing another HOA to rise from the ashes, we formed a simple neighborhood committee, voluntary, with no power to fine or enforce ridiculous rules. It was just a way for people to come together, address real concerns, and figure out solutions without turning into a dictatorship. We organized a few meetings, discussed how we could handle maintenance without forcing people to pay mandatory fees, and worked out a system where those who wanted to contribute could, while those who prefer to be left alone wouldn't be pressured. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Over time, people adjusted, and the fears of complete chaos without an HOA faded away. As things settled, I finally got back to enjoying my life the way I had planned from the beginning. My cabin remained untouched by nosy rule makers. My dock was mine alone to use, and my fence stood tall, reminding anyone who might get ideas that my land was private and always would be. I spent my days fishing, fixing up small projects around my property, and sitting on my porch with a cold drink, watching the lake shimmer into the sun. One evening, as I was packing up my fishing gear after a long day on the water, I spotted something near the edge of my property, a familiar figure standing just beyond the fence line. My heart immediately tensed, but as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't Karen. It was someone else, a woman I didn't recognize, probably one of the newer homeowners who had moved in after the HOA dissolved. She seemed hesitant, unsure whether she should approach. I stayed where I was, waiting. After a moment, she finally stepped forward and called out, her voice friendly but cautious. She introduced herself, explained that she had bought a house nearby and had heard about the whole Karen situation. She wanted to know if the rumors were true, if the HOA had really been that bad, and how things had changed since it was gone. I told her the truth. I told her about Karen's reign of terror, about the ridiculous rules, the trespassing, the battles I had fought just to be left alone. I told her about how the neighborhood had transformed, how people were finally free to live their lives without fear of being fined for something as stupid as a flower bed that didn't match the approved color scheme. She listened, nodding thoughtfully, and then she smiled. "I'm glad I moved here," she said, looking around at the quiet beauty of the lake. "It seems like a good place to be." I nodded, watching as she turned and walked away, back toward her home, where she would never have to deal with an HOA breathing down her neck. That was the moment I knew, without a doubt, that it had all been worth it. The fights, the stress, the long battles against Karen and her minions. Every bit of it had led to this, to a neighborhood that finally belonged to the people who lived in it. As I stood there, watching the last light of the sun fade behind the trees, I felt nothing but peace. The war was over. The HOA was gone. And for the first time in a long time, I knew that my home, my land, was truly mine forever.